democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We continue to look at the case of Mahamadou Ould Slahi, a Mauritanian man who's been held at Guantánamo for 12 years without charge. His writings were published this week as the book Guantánamo Diary. Slahi's 466-page handwritten manuscript was initially classified by the U.S. government and heavily redacted before publication.
It was held for more than 7 years before it's been released. We're joined now by three guests. Nancy Hollander is Mahamadou Ould Slahi's lead lawyer. Larry Sims is editor of Guantánamo Diary. And Colonel Morris Davis is the former chief military prosecutor at Guantánamo Bay. He resigned in 2007, shortly after he met with Mahamadou Ould Slahi. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Colonel Morris Davis, talk about who Mahamadou was, how you met him there, and did your resignation have anything to do with him?
Yeah, I met him early in 2007 as we were preparing, the prosecution of the military commission cases at Guantánamo. We were interested in potentially finding a detainee or detainees that would be cooperating witnesses. And I was told that Slahi and his partner, Tariq al-Sawa, they lived in a compound of their own, that the two of them were candidates, potential candidates to cooperate with the prosecution. So I met with Mr. Slahi probably 3 or 4 times over a course of several months, and got to know him probably as well as any of the detainees that I had contact with at Guantánamo.
And what was your impression of him? How did he affect you?
Well, it was really an interesting contrast. He and Tariq Sawa lived together in a compound of their own. At the time, back in 2007, Guantánamo was supposed to be this super secret facility that you couldn't really talk about, but you could go on Google Earth, and if you knew what you were looking for, you could drill down and see their compound where they lived and their vegetable garden that was between their two huts where they lived. They were a sharp contrast. Mr. Slahi is maybe 5'6" and weighs about 110 pounds last time I saw him. And Mr. Sawa was probably 6 feet tall and weighed over 350 pounds. So just their physical appearance was like the odd couple, and personality-wise as well. Mr. Sawa was polite and would, if you ask him something, he would respond, but he didn't carry a conversation. Where with Mr. Slahi, the problem wasn't getting him to talk, it was getting him to stop, because he was very gregarious. As you can see from the diary, he's very articulate, very bright, and it was always a pleasure to meet with him. I mean, every time I went, I mentioned the article I wrote for The Guardian that every time I went, he had to make tea using mint leaf from the garden. And, Guantánamo was always hot and humid, and I was in uniform, and I'm not a tea drinker to begin with, but I'd have to sit and drink hot tea and, sweat in the sun and chat with Mr. Slahi.
And Nancy Hollander, you've been Slahi's legal representative since he's been allowed legal representation, that is, since 2005. Can you tell us how you came to work on this case and how it is that he's been held for 12 years and has yet to be charged with anything?
I came to work on this case because a lawyer in France, a lawyer named Emmanuel Altit, sent me an email saying that he had heard from a lawyer in Mauritania, Mr. Ribete, that the family of Mahamadou thought he was in Guantánamo, and that now that the prisoners could have lawyers, would I consider seeing if I could represent him. I found him. I found that he had been assigned to another lawyer by the Center for Constitutional Rights. That lawyer was Sylvia Royce. And although Sylvia left the team later on, at the beginning, the two of us made arrangements to go to Guantánamo. And our first visit was perhaps the one that sticks in my head the most. We went, it was our very first visit to Guantánamo for both of us. We walked into the hut, the guards opened the door, and there was Mahamadou, and he stood up and he smiled and he put his arms out as though to walk up to embrace us, but he didn't move. And we stood there for a moment, and then I realized, to my horror, that he was chained to the floor with chains around his ankle and couldn't move, so he could just stand there and smile. and we walked into his embrace. And he hugged us. I think we were the first people he had hugged in several years. And then he gave us these first 90 pages as a way for us to know about him, to know something about him and what had happened to him. And that's how this book began. And we encouraged him to keep writing, and then he continued to write.
Nancy
He's
Hollander,
never been charged with, I'm sorry.
You were saying he's never been charged with a crime. Nancy Hollander, can you describe what happened to him when the U.S. detained him, first before Guantanamo and then at Guantanamo? In Guantanamo Diary, Slahi's book, he says one of the interrogators said, quote, "I know I can go to hell for what I do to you."
Well, what that guard was referring to was specifically not letting him pray. One of the things that was on the list of special interrogation techniques that the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, approved specifically for Mahamadou was that he not be allowed to pray. He was also put in what they called their frequent flyer program, which meant he was not allowed to sleep. He was interrogated round the clock, and maybe he would get an hour or two of sleep, and then they would wake him up. So this went on for almost 2 months, or maybe even longer. They dragged him out on a boat. First, they came into his cell with a dog, terrified him, put a hood over him, put goggles on, put earmuffs on, dragged him. We were able to learn from his medical records that he complained that his ribs were broken, and in fact they were broken on that when they beat him. And they took him out, and he was, as he says in the book, afraid that they were going to dump him in the ocean or take him to some other place. For a long, long time, they did not tell him he was back in Guantanamo. They beat him, they terrified him, they put ice down his clothes, they kept him in cold rooms, then they kept him in hot rooms. They knew that he had a back issue from a previous injury, and that the doctor in Guantanamo had ordered that he not have to stay in certain positions, and they used that. And those were the positions they put him in, precisely what they knew he was not supposed to be in. The litany goes on and on of what they did to him.
But Nancy, even before Slahi got to Guantanamo, he had been detained for almost a year. He was picked up on his way from, I believe, from Canada to Mauritania. He was picked up in Senegal. Then he was detained in Mauritania, then sent to Jordan under the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Program for 7.5 months. Then from there to Bagram, and from Bagram to Guantanamo. Can you describe what happened in the course of his going to Guantanamo?
Well, he was picked up twice. First in Senegal, when he left Montreal, he flew to Senegal, and that's where his family was going to meet him to drive home to Nouakchott in Mauritania. He was detained there. Then later he was detained again in Mauritania, and then finally he was at his mother's house, and this was the third time, and he got another call from the police station, then the police chief, and they said, "Would you come and talk to us, and bring your own car? We're sure you won't be staying long." And he never went back. They took him to Jordan. He was there for 7.5 or 8 months. He was interrogated there. He was not tortured in the same way, but he was put in a cell where he could hear other people screaming and crying, and was terrified every moment that he was there. And then suddenly another plane comes. He thinks he's going home, and in fact he ends up in Afghanistan for a couple of weeks, and then goes to Guantanamo. And at that time, the government was claiming that it was taking people from the battlefield in Afghanistan, which of course wasn't true. Only about 5% of the people in Guantanamo were ever actually on a battlefield. But he came from Afghanistan in a harrowing airplane ride to Guantanamo and was interrogated as soon as he got there, and then was interrogated and tortured. And even after he agreed to tell them whatever they wanted to hear, they continued with their what he called the recipe of torture.
I want to
But
turn
he was
to...
never charged, ever charged with any crime.